The drama surrounding the heavyweight clash between Mike, the Rebel Perez and Carlos Takam was one that few people saw coming, and even fewer expected to unfold the way it did. On paper, this was supposed to be a showcase, a carefully orchestrated stepping stone for the Cuban-born, Ireland-based Perez, a man who had been building serious momentum in the heavyweight division and was being touted as one of the most technically gifted big men to emerge in years. Takam, the Cameroon-born French fighter, was supposed to be the appetizer before the main course. He was the man brought in to make Perez look good, to give the Cuban stylist enough resistance to be interesting without being enough of a threat to cause any real alarm. But boxing, as it always does, had other plans entirely. From the opening bell in Montreal, with a crowd of over 20,000 packed into the arena, Perez came out doing exactly what his Cuban amateur pedigree had trained him to do: measured, calculated, and intelligent. He was the kind of fighter who had been forged in the legendary Cuban boxing system, a machine built not for chaos but for precision. His trainers expected him to control the tempo, to dictate range, and to pick Takam apart the way a surgeon works: clean, deliberate, and decisive. And for the first portion of the fight, that is precisely what he did. Perez settled into his rhythm early, working his left hand, establishing respect, and making it abundantly clear that despite giving up significant weight, somewhere in the region of 25 pounds, he was the more dangerous man between the two. Takam's corner knew their fighter couldn't outpunch Perez. That wasn't a debate anyone was having seriously. The Cameroonian had power, but Perez carried the kind of pop that commanded respect from the opening exchanges, and Takam felt it immediately. So rather than charging forward recklessly, Takam made a calculated decision: he would box. He would fight from the outside, use his jab, fight behind his shoulder in a style that drew comparisons to the great James Toney, and he would try to survive the early storm before making his move later. It was unconventional. It was unexpected. And to many watching in the arena and on television, it was frustrating. But it was also, quietly and cleverly, effective. The early rounds told the story of a fight that had not yet truly begun. Perez was landing, no question about it. He was finding Takam with the left hand, catching him clean on occasion, and generally controlling the action in a way that suggested the night would go according to the script that had been written for it. The commentators noted how Perez was picking his opponent apart, and the early scorecards reflected that reality. Harold Letterman, the unofficial scorer at ringside, had Perez winning those opening rounds, and there wasn't much controversy in that assessment. The Cuban looked composed, disciplined, and well within himself. There was a sense that he was simply waiting for the moment to pull away definitively. But then came the headbutt. In round 3, a clash of heads opened a cut on Perez that immediately changed the atmosphere of the fight. The gash was long and in a troublesome spot, not directly above the corner of the eye, but close enough that blood began streaming down his face and into his vision. The moment could have descended into ugliness, and in the world of professional boxing, where the temptation to take a cheap shot on a wounded opponent runs strong, nobody would have been entirely surprised if things had gotten dirty. But Takam, and this moment earned him enormous respect from the broadcast team and the crowd, turned away. He walked to the neutral corner, signaled his apology, and waited for the referee to sort things out. It was a remarkably honorable gesture from a man who had every incentive to behave otherwise, and it spoke volumes about his character inside the ropes. With the cut now a factor, Abel Sanchez, Perez's renowned trainer, the same man who had Gennady Golovkin in his camp, worked furiously between rounds to contain the bleeding. And to his enormous credit, he did. The blood was managed well enough that it never became the defining storyline of the fight, though it lingered as a backdrop throughout the middle rounds. The cut also subtly shifted the tactical calculus for both men. Takam, now aware that a cut resulting from an accidental headbutt could lead to a technical stoppage and a potentially complicated scorecard decision, had even more reason to stay disciplined, keep his distance, and avoid giving Perez clean counterpunching opportunities. Every head-to-head exchange carried an extra layer of risk now, and Takam was smart enough to understand that. As the fight moved into the 4th and 5th rounds, something began to shift. It was subtle at first, the kind of change that only becomes obvious in retrospect, once you've already watched the momentum swing away from the man you thought was in control. Takam began landing right hands. Not jabs, not glancing shots, but clean, snapping right hands that caught Perez flush and sent his head back. The broadcasters noticed it. The crowd noticed it. And most importantly, Perez felt it. Suddenly the Cuban, who was supposed to be the dominant figure in this narrative, was being made to think. He was being made to feel the weight of a man who had quietly been studying him all night, waiting for the right moment to introduce himself properly. The sixth round was when everything changed. Takam, who had spent the opening half of the fight being patient and strategic to the point of frustrating the paying public, suddenly turned the dial all the way up. He stepped inside, started working the body with serious intent, through combinations, and took the fight to Perez in a way that had been entirely absent from the earlier rounds. Between the two men in that sixth round alone, they landed 55 punches, and Takam landed 33 of them. It was a stunning reversal. The crowd, which had grown restless during the slow early going, erupted. Letterman, who had scored the fight clearly in Perez's favor heading into the midpoint, suddenly found himself revising his assessment. Takam had landed on his feet. More than that, he had landed on Perez's chin. What made Takam's performance so impressive as the fight progressed was not just his physical ability but his boxing intellect. He had fought 3 weeks before this night, a remarkable fact in itself, and yet he showed no signs of fatigue, no lingering damage, no mental residue from the previous effort. If anything, he looked sharper for having been in the gym and active. His understanding of pace and timing was exceptional. He knew when to press, when to back off, when to bait Perez into exchanges and then punish him for walking in. He worked the body consistently and intelligently, focusing his shots below Perez's ribs to drain the Cuban's engine as the rounds accumulated. It was the kind of tactical sophistication that you do not typically associate with a fighter who was supposed to be the supporting act. Perez, meanwhile, was beginning to show the effects. Not dramatically, not in the way that would suggest a stoppage was imminent, but in the small and telling ways that experienced fight observers learn to read. His punches were landing less cleanly. His footwork, never his greatest attribute given his tendency to fight upright rather than getting low as his trainers wanted, was becoming less fluid. The body shots from Takam were accumulating, and the weight of a bigger man pressing on him round after round was beginning to take a toll that pure technical skill could not entirely offset. There was also, perhaps, the unspoken shadow of the Abdul Salamov fight still hanging over him. A brutal, draining performance that had taken something from him, even if the exact nature of that something was hard to quantify. By the time the 9th round arrived, Letterman had the fight essentially even. The commanding lead that Perez had built through the opening rounds had been entirely consumed by Takam's second-half surge. The fight, which had once looked like a straightforward victory for the Cuban, had transformed into something genuinely uncertain and genuinely compelling. Takam's corner, reading the situation with urgency, delivered a clear and direct instruction between rounds, relayed through a French interpreter. You must put him down. You must put Mike Perez on the canvas in this final round. It was not a suggestion. It was a demand born from the understanding that on the scorecards, the margin was thin enough that a knockdown could be the difference between a win and something less. Takam answered the call. In the 10th and final round, he came forward with genuine menace, throwing uppercuts that snapped Perez's head back and landing right hands that carried real authority. He pressed, he worked, he tried with everything he had to finish the job that his corner had asked of him. Perez, to his enormous credit, stood firm. The Cuban, who had been forged in the discipline of the amateur system and trained to absorb punishment and keep moving, did not go down. He survived the round, threw his own shots, and made it to the final bell on his feet. But the question of who had won the fight, who deserved to leave Montreal with their hand raised, was one that the judges would have to answer, and it was far from a formality. When the scorecards were read, the result landed like a thunderclap. 2 judges scored the fight 95-95. The 3rd judge agreed. A majority draw. The title, such as it was in this context, stayed where it was. Neither man had truly lost. but neither man had truly won either. Perez, who had entered the night as the man everyone expected to dominate, walked away having been pushed to the absolute limit by a fighter nobody had expected to be a genuine problem. Takam, who had absorbed the early punishment, changed the fight at the midpoint, and nearly pulled off one of the more surprising results in recent heavyweight boxing, walked away without the victory his second half deserved, but with something arguably more valuable, a reputation. The story of this fight is ultimately about the beauty and the brutality of the uncertainty that makes boxing unlike anything else in sport. You can plan for everything. You can have the better pedigree, the better trainer, the better amateur record, the backing of HBO, the momentum of a rising career, and still find yourself in the 10th round fighting for your life against a man who was supposed to be your launching pad. Carlos Takam arrived in Montreal as a footnote and left as a headline. Mike Perez arrived as a future contender and left with a question mark he hadn't carried going in. And the 20,000 people who filled that arena witnessed something far more memorable than the comfortable showcase they might have anticipated. They witnessed a real fight, full of drama, full of heart, and full of the kind of unexpected narrative turns that only the heavyweight division can consistently deliver. What do you think about how this fight unfolded? Did Mike Perez underperform? Or did Carlos Takam simply outperform every expectation placed on him heading into that Montreal night? Was the draw a fair result, or did one man deserve the decision more than the judges were willing to give? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is exactly the kind of fight that demands a conversation. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more deep dive storytelling on the greatest moments and hidden gems in boxing history, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss what we put out next. The heavyweight division has more stories like this one, and we are just getting started.